In the middle of the glass room, my name was spoken like a verdict, not shouted, not argued, delivered. A screen glowed with numbers I recognized, figures now twisted into accusations. Someone said catastrophic, someone else said negligence. I stood while everyone else sat, the only one without a microphone, the only one whose explanation wasn't requested. Silence followed, heavy and rehearsed, the kind that decides outcomes before anyone votes. He was there. At the far end of the table, arms folded, expression unreadable. People glanced at him before speaking, adjusting their tone as if checking the weather. When I tried to respond, a hand lifted gently, not mine. The room obeyed it instantly. My words died in my throat. I remember thinking that if he cleared his voice, this would end. He didn't. He watched, and that felt worse than accusation. The questions kept coming, layered with disappointment instead of curiosity. Why wasn't this caught sooner? Who approved the final review? How long had I been overlooking risks? Each sentence shaved something off me. Credibility, confidence, air. I searched faces for confusion, for doubt, for mercy, but found calculation instead. I was already being measured for how replaceable I was. No one mentioned my previous reports. No one referenced the warnings I'd sent. The narrative had been chosen, and I was convenient. Papers shifted. A pen clicked. Someone suggested a formal inquiry as if it were a kindness. The chair creaked when I shifted my weight, loud enough to draw another glance toward him. Still nothing. Just that steady, distant focus, as though I were a case study instead of a person. I felt small in a way that had nothing to do with rank. It was the kind of smallness that comes from realizing the rules are flexible, but only for certain people. I wondered how many others had stood where I was standing now, believing effort would protect them. I wondered if they'd blamed themselves afterward, replaying every moment they should have spoken differently. The meeting ended without a decision, which somehow felt like one. People filed out quietly, avoiding my eyes. As I gathered my things, a passing shoulder brushed mine, not accidental, not apologetic. The door closed behind the last executive, sealing me in with the hum of the building and the echo of my name still hanging in the air. Before he left, he paused, not long enough to draw attention, just enough for me to notice. His gaze met mine, sharp and assessing, and for a second I thought he might say something. He didn't. He nodded once, the smallest acknowledgement, then turned away. If you've ever felt that moment, when someone with power chooses silence over fairness, you know how heavy it sits. It makes you question not just your choices, but your worth. And if you've ever taken someone's quiet labor for granted, ask yourself now what it cost them to keep showing up. I carried that silence with me as I stepped into the hallway, feeling it cling to my coat and my skin. It followed me past closed offices, past screensavers and half-emptied mugs, past people who suddenly remembered urgent emails. I kept thinking how easy it is to look away when consequences belong to someone else, how comfort grows from distance, how systems stay clean by making messes human. I promised myself I would remember this feeling, not to harden, but to stay awake. Even now, recalling it, my chest tightens, because recognition came too late. That morning still echoes. That was the moment I realized this wasn't about work anymore. I arrived with optimism already bruised, the kind that learns to stay quiet. The building rose clean and reflective against the sky, all sharp lines and certainty, and I remember pausing before going inside, adjusting my collar as if that could prepare me. Inside, voices softened when his name was mentioned, not announced, invoked. Conversations changed direction mid-sentence. People straightened, smiled too quickly, checked their screens. Power didn't need to introduce itself here. It moved through the room like a current everyone had learned to respect. He passed by my desk on the first day without slowing, his presence marked by the way others reacted more than by anything he did. Chairs shifted. Laughter stopped. Someone whispered my name as if warning me. I hadn't earned his attention yet, and somehow that felt more dangerous than having it. When he finally spoke to me days later, it was in a meeting already half over. He corrected a minor phrasing choice, precise and public, then moved on. No follow-up, no acknowledgement, just a reminder of hierarchy delivered with surgical calm. The stories came in fragments. Someone reassigned after pushing back once. Another who vanished from the org chart after a closed-door conversation. No one said fired. They said moved on, like a natural process. When he entered a room, people leaned back instinctively, creating space without being asked. I noticed how his silence commanded more than most people's anger. It wasn't volatility that frightened them. It was certainty. With me, the edges sharpened. Tasks arrived late in the day with early morning deadlines. Files returned annotated in red, not harsh, just thorough enough to imply inadequacy. Praise never landed where others could hear it. Critique always did. I told myself it was merit-based, that I simply had more to learn. But there were moments, too many, when his gaze lingered a second longer than necessary, weighing something invisible, testing, maybe, or deciding. I learned to speak less in meetings, choosing precision over presence. Even then my contributions were summarized by someone else, approved with a nod that never reached me. It felt intentional, like being trained to disappear gracefully. Once I overheard two managers near the elevator. One asked, "Do you think he'll last?" The other shrugged. "Depends if he figures it out in time." They noticed me then and stopped talking, faces carefully neutral. The assignment that followed was impossible by design. A compressed review across overlapping jurisdictions, conflicting data, and a deadline that ignored reality. When I asked for clarification, the response came clipped and final. "You'll manage." I worked until the cleaning crew learned my schedule. I slept with my laptop open, dreams filled with spreadsheets and red flags. Every time I thought I'd reached the bottom, another layer appeared. What unsettled me wasn't the workload. It was the sense of being watched, not to help, but to measure failure. Comments appeared in shared documents minutes after I saved changes. Questions surfaced in meetings before I'd sent updates. Once I changed a single line late at night. By morning it was circled in red, flagged as a concern. I stared at the timestamp, then at my own reflection in the dark screen, wondering who else was reading along. If you've ever felt that pressure, the sense that effort isn't enough because the outcome was decided before you started. You know how it erodes you quietly. It makes you doubt your instincts, your timing, your right to occupy space. And it makes you work harder anyway, because stopping feels like surrender. By the time I submitted the final review, my hands were shaking. I sent it, closed my laptop, and sat back, waiting for the familiar silence. It didn't come. Instead, a notification blinked almost immediately. A comment. Not addressed to me, about me. And that was when I realized someone was watching my work too closely. I learned to survive by shrinking. I stopped eating lunch at my desk because the wrappers made noise. I learned which elevators he used and which he avoided. I arrived early, left late, and spoke only when numbers demanded it. At night, When the office lights dimmed and the city outside softened, I let myself breathe. That was when reality followed me home. My mother's hospital statements arrived like clockwork, heavy envelopes with polite language and unforgiving totals. Every deadline at work echoed one from the billing office. Miss one, and the consequences multiplied. So I tied my life to precision. I checked figures until they blurred. I reread policies until sentences lost meaning. Accuracy became less about pride and more about survival. I started documenting everything. Not out of paranoia, I told myself, but professionalism. Emails were saved, revisions archived, comments screenshotted. I kept a private folder with timestamps and cross-references, updating it nightly like a ritual. Before shutting down my computer, I'd open it once more, just to confirm it existed, just to remind myself I wasn't imagining the patterns. If you've ever felt unseen while carrying responsibilities no one else would notice, you know how comforting proof can be. The breaking point came on a call I hadn't been scheduled to lead. A vendor clause flashed on the screen, highlighted in red, and my name followed it like a stain. Someone asked why it hadn't been flagged sooner. I felt the room tilt. I had flagged it. Weeks ago. The evidence was there, buried in a thread no one wanted to open. When I tried to explain, I was cut off with a tone that sounded patient, but wasn't. The laughter that followed was soft, nervous, rehearsed. Afterward, he leaned over my desk, close enough that I could smell his cologne, and said quietly that maybe this pace wasn't for everyone. It wasn't a threat. It was an assessment. People nearby pretended not to hear. I nodded because arguing felt pointless. In the restroom, I stared at my reflection until my face looked unfamiliar, wondering how long dignity lasts when it's never defended. That night I stayed later than usual, reorganizing my files with obsessive care. I labeled everything clearly, backed it up twice, and added notes no one else would read. It felt like building a raft while the water was already rising. I told myself this was temporary, that competence would eventually speak louder than suspicion. If you're listening to this and thinking you'd have done something sooner, I thought that too. I told myself silence was strategic, that endurance was professionalism. But every time I swallowed a correction I didn't deserve, someone else learned it was acceptable. That's how systems train us to cooperate with our own erasure. We call it patience. We call it maturity. And later, when the weight becomes unbearable, we wonder why no one noticed we were drowning. If this sounds familiar, sit with that discomfort. It's trying to tell you something important, before it costs you more than you're prepared to lose eventually anyway. The next morning, an HR representative stopped by my desk, smiling too widely, asking casual questions about my workload and stress levels. She already knew the answers. Her eyes flicked to my screen, then to the folder I minimized too late. The conversation ended with reassurance and a reminder about company policy. As she walked away, I understood something I'd been avoiding. HR wasn't there to protect me. They were there to observe. I didn't know it yet, but that folder would save my life. The audit arrived without drama, slipped into my inbox like a courtesy. Subject line, neutral. Language, polite. Routine review, it said, the kind every department survived eventually. I read it twice, then a third time, because something about the timing felt off. The scope was narrow, but the access it requested wasn't. Financial records I hadn't touched in months. Vendor files that crossed departments. I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, the sense that the ground was shifting again. I followed protocol. I reviewed the materials, traced the invoices, matched signatures. That's when the pattern appeared, faint at first, then undeniable. A shell vendor cycling freight charges through layered accounts, numbers rounded just enough to avoid alarms. The trail threaded through my department, not because we created it, but because we touched everything. I sat back, staring at the screen, knowing this wasn't something you ignored and kept your job. It was something you reported and lost it, so I reported it, internally, by the book. I attached documentation, flagged inconsistencies, and sent it up the chain with a neutral summary. 2 hours later, my calendar updated without warning. His name. No explanation, just a time and a room. He didn't sit when I entered. He stood by the window, city lights bleeding into the glass. He asked if I enjoyed digging, voice casual, eyes not quite meeting mine. I answered carefully, saying I followed procedures. He nodded once, slow, and said I should be careful what I unearthed. It could have been concern. It could have been a threat. The ambiguity lingered long after he dismissed me. By Friday, the inquiry opened, not into the vendor, into me. HR cited altered documents, irregular timestamps, questions about intent. I felt cold reading the summary because the evidence was clean, too clean. Someone had scrubbed it, polished it, reshaped it into something sharp enough to cut me. I printed the notice, folded it neatly, and packed my desk in silence while the office buzzed on around me. If you've ever been framed, you know the disbelief hits first. Then the math. How long until security walks you out? How fast your reputation collapses? I slipped my notebook into my bag, my hands steady, only because panic had nowhere left to go. The elevator chimed as I approached, doors opening like an invitation. As I stepped inside, a shadow crossed the threshold. His hand reached out, stopping the doors inches apart. The car shuddered, caught between floors. He looked at me then, really looked, and for a moment I thought he might explain everything. Instead, he said quietly, almost urgently, that I shouldn't leave yet. The doors began to close. Then they stopped. He led me back into the building without touching my arm, as if contact itself might be evidence. The conference room lights were off, city glow spilling through the windows, turning glass into mirrors. He didn't sit. Neither did I. He spoke in fragments, facts, arranged without apology. The vendor was real, the fraud deliberate, and the name attached to it carried weight far above both of us. Family, he said, without emphasis, a connection he hadn't chosen and couldn't escape. My report had accelerated something already in motion. The inquiry against me was a diversion, crude but effective. I listened, arms crossed because believing him felt reckless. He slid a folder across the table anyway. Emails, timestamps, financial maps layered with intent. Proof that someone else wanted this buried fast. He admitted he'd pushed me. Tight deadlines, public corrections, pressure meant to sharpen, not break. Invisible, he said, useful. I almost laughed at that. The logic was offensive, the arrogance familiar. Still, the evidence was real, and it contradicted the story HR was telling. Then he added the part that changed everything. Monday. A board meeting already scheduled, my name already placed. A controlled collapse designed to protect people who wouldn't flinch when I disappeared. He had a counterfile, he said, but it required testimony. Mine. Trust wasn't requested, it was assumed, and that assumption burned. While he spoke, I opened my laptop, not to challenge him, but to reassure myself. My folder loaded slowly. Then I saw it. A login timestamp that wasn't mine. An access point outside our network, not his, not IT. Someone else had opened my files, copied them, and closed them again. The room felt smaller after that. This wasn't a duel. It was a hunt, and we were both moving targets now. I looked up, and for the first time, his control slipped. He hadn't known. That realization landed between us, heavy and unspoken. We stood there in silence, each calculating the other's breaking point. He offered protection without warmth. I offered cooperation without loyalty, mutual dependence, stripped of comfort. If you've ever taken someone for granted, assuming their silence meant safety, you know how fragile that belief is. Sometimes the quiet person is holding the structure together while everyone else leans. Comment below. Have you ever taken someone for granted, only to realize too late what they were protecting? He outlined the plan with precision, still commanding the room even as the walls closed in. Information would be released selectively. I would prepare my statement, but say nothing publicly until called. He would go first, burn bridges, buy time. I asked what happened if it failed. He didn't answer. That was answer enough. When we finally left the room, the hallway felt exposed. Every camera, a witness. He walked ahead, not beside me, keeping distance like a boundary and a shield. At my desk, I gathered what mattered and left the rest behind. The city outside looked unchanged, indifferent to timing and consequence. My phone buzzed with unread messages I didn't open. If Monday came, I would be destroyed. Or everything would. The weekend stretched thin and useless, every hour too loud with possibility. I didn't trust silence anymore. It meant someone else was moving. I reviewed the plan he'd outlined, step by step, looking for the flaw that would expose me first. He kept information compartmentalized, offering only what he decided I needed. Control came naturally to him, even now. Especially now. I hated that part of myself that still recognized the efficiency in it. We communicated in short bursts, messages stripped of tone, updates without reassurance. He never asked how I was holding up. I never asked what this would cost him. There was a line we didn't cross, not out of respect, but because crossing it would make betrayal easier. Trust, I learned, isn't built when stakes are high. It's rationed. Sunday night, I ran another check on my files, tracing access logs the way I'd learned to read hospital charts, back when my mother's numbers mattered more than my own. The same unfamiliar signature appeared again, earlier this time, closer to the core documents. Someone wasn't just copying. They were tracking revisions, anticipating moves. I forwarded the metadata without commentary. His reply came fast. Too fast. A single word. Confirmed. That was when the weight shifted. It wasn't about whether he'd sacrifice me anymore. It was about how many others would, without hesitation. The system wasn't malfunctioning. It was operating exactly as designed. He still held leverage, but not enough to protect both of us cleanly. I could feel him recalculating, tightening his grip on the narrative, deciding what to reveal and what to bury. I refused to hand over everything. I sent summaries, not sources. Enough to be useful, not enough to be erased. If you've ever stood beside someone powerful, while knowing you could be crushed just as easily as shielded, you understand the loneliness of that position. Dependency without comfort. Alliance without warmth. We were aligned by necessity, not belief, and necessity is fickle. Late that night, my phone rang from a blocked number. No voice on the line, just breathing, measured and deliberate. Then a click. Minutes later, an email appeared in my draft folder, unsent, containing a sentence I hadn't written, a reminder about loyalty, about consequences. I deleted it, then restored it, then saved it somewhere no one else knew to look. Proof mattered more than fear. Monday loomed like a verdict already drafted. He sent the final instructions just before dawn: where to sit, when to speak, when to stay silent. He would go first. He would absorb the initial blow. I would follow only if necessary. It was a strategy built on sacrifice, and I couldn't tell which of us he was preparing to lose. As I dressed, hands steady despite the noise in my head, I wondered how many times I'd mistaken control for protection, how often I'd allowed someone else to define safety on their terms. If this ended badly, it wouldn't be because I trusted him. It would be because I trusted a system that rewarded silence and punished truth. The car ride was quiet. Too quiet. My phone buzzed once more, this time with a forwarded message from an internal address I didn't recognize. A calendar invite, private session, board members only, my name included. Someone else knew, and they weren't staying quiet.